With our Tekno EB48 2.1 buggy now taking shape, it's almost time to finish up on the chassis with its various mounting brackets for electronics. Although before we do that, we need to get through the next two bags, L and M, front and rear shock assembly. Bag L contains the front shock kit. These are basically the same as the previous version of the buggy with only some slight differences. Well, just the shock piston it seems, as well as the springs. Anyways, you'll need some O-ring grease for this bag, so with that to hand, let's get started. With the main shock body in hand, place the black rubber O-ring around the top threads, making sure it seats nicely down into the groove. Next, we can reach for our dowel ring pieces as well as the shock O-rings. Before inserting these, I like to place a dab of grease around the inside here, after which the small hat washer goes in with the hat facing upwards. Then we want to apply some grease to an O-ring before inserting it on the top, followed by the center washer, another greased O-ring, and finally the larger hat washer with the hat facing downwards. I like to apply a small amount of Loctite to the threads here, only a very small amount, too much and you won't get it back off, before screwing down the cap, just so it's snug holding everything in place. Don't over tighten just yet as we want to get the shock shaft through first. Talking of the shock shaft, we need to attach our shock piston, so grab the shock shaft with your shock tool and drop the piston into position. Notice how it's flat one side and curved the other. Well, you'll want the flat side on the top for quicker rebound, used when the buggy is run on smooth surfaces, or turn it over with the curved side on top for quicker compression, so for bumpier conditions. Once decided, lock into place with a zinc lock nut. Don't over tighten here, the piston is plastic and you don't want to crack, squash or expand it. I generally tighten so that there's no side to side movement in the piston, but you can just about rotate it with your fingers. Before inserting into the shock body, apply some grease to the threads to prevent it from tearing the O-rings, before pushing through the body, and then wipe off any excess grease once through. With the shaft through, we can now tighten up the shock cartridge. The shock tool comes to the rescue yet again here. Making sure the shock shaft is nice and smooth, we can drop on a shock boot. Don't try to stretch it over the rod end afterwards. And then grip the shock tool again and proceed to install the rod end. You want to make sure the rod ends on all four shocks go on the same amount. You don't really want different sized shocks because the rod ends have been screwed on different levels, so take it all the way, before popping on a pivot ball through the rod end, and making sure the ball moves freely. If it doesn't, you need to back the rod end off a little. Finally, we can install the shock collar. Again, apply some grease to the collar and it'll go on much easier, and go ahead and screw it onto the shock body. Repeat the entire process with the second shock, so we now have two built units. With that done, we're ready to fill the shocks with oil. These are front shocks, so we'll need the 650 CST bottle handy. Now you do have either option of an emulsion shock or a bladder shock, useful for setting your own rebound, although we'll go with emulsion shocks for now. That said, we'll start by preparing the caps, and all that needs doing here is to insert a rubber O-ring into the far end of the cap, after which we can install the tiny O-ring onto the bleed screw. The best way I've found to do this is to coat the O-ring with a drop of shock oil to help prevent a tear, place it on a paper towel or the end of your finger, and then push the bleed screw onto it before pushing the O-ring to the top of the screw. Okay, so now we can go ahead and proceed to fill the shock with oil, after which we pump the shock shaft from bottom to top around 5 times. Complete the same filling process with the second shock too. Next, proceed to screw the cap onto the first shock body by hand, taking care not to cross-thread the caps, and tighten down using the Tekno wheel wrench to ensure it's nice and secure. Once in place, hold the shock at a 45-degree angle with the bleed hole facing upwards, press the shock shaft so that it's all the way to the top, wiping away any excess oil, and while holding, insert the bleed screw into the cap until snug. Next, we need to pump the shock shaft up and down vigorously around 20 times or so in order to emulsify the oil, after which the shaft can be fully extended and the bleed screw removed, again facing upwards at an angle. And push the shaft all the way up again, wiping any excess oil if need be, and finally tighten down the bleed screw until snug. And that's it, first shock fully prepared. After replicating the same process on the other shock, we have both front shocks complete. All that's left is to adjust the shock collar to your liking, insert into the supplied spring, different rates to the predecessor mind, insert a spring perch on the opposite end to hold it in place, and insert a set screw to secure. Finally, insert a shock cap bushing into the shock cap, and with both done, we're ready to mount to the buggy. When mounting the shocks to the buggy, note that the slot in the spring perch should face the outside of the vehicle. So with that in mind, slide the shock cap into the shock standoff and screw on a flanged lock nut to secure into place. I find it easy to hold the shock standoff with a wrench while tightening the nut down. The bottom of the shock is secured to the suspension arm, the inside hole being the stock position, with a single 18mm shock mount screw securing it in place. Note that the silver screw is left-hand threaded and goes in on the right side of the vehicle. Repeat on the opposite side, so lock nut up on the shock standoff, and 18mm shock mount screw on the lower inside hole, this one being black and right-hand threaded. And with that, our front shocks are complete. The extended length rear shocks in bag M are slightly different to the front, so it's a good idea to build a set at a time rather than get them mixed up. The lower shock bushings are slightly longer, the new springs are now a yellow rate, and the shock oil is slightly thinner, but otherwise the process in building them is exactly the same, so we won't cover the process all over again, and I've prepared them off camera instead. Again, we mount these onto the shock standoffs with a single nut, taking care to make sure the slot in the spring perch is facing outwards, and again using the black screw on the left side and the silver screw on the right side of the buggy. Not a necessity, but I always like my bleed screws to be pointing upwards on all my shocks too. And with that, we're done. That's bags L and M complete, and with both front and rear shocks mounted onto the vehicle. That's pretty much all the main parts of the vehicle built and complete now, and it's looking great so far. In the next part, we move on to bag N, installing parts onto the main chassis ready for electronics.